sometimes trying to figure out why countries do what they do internationally. I mean,
Yeah.
it feels like you're looking at this uh, really complex machine.
Yeah, definitely. Like a puzzle with missing pieces.
Exactly. And it's just tough to see the underlying logic sometimes.
That's precisely the challenge. And, that's where these theoretical frameworks can really help to give us a structure, a way to try and make sense of it all.
Right. And today we're going to plunge into one of the big ones, offensive realism.
Mm,
It's a perspective that's, well, mostly linked with John Mearsheimer's book, The Tragedy of Great Power Politics. And it gives us a pretty stark lens, doesn't it?
it certainly does.
Yeah.
Stark but powerful for viewing how major players act. And you've shared some great excerpts from Mearsheimer, which is fantastic. Allows us to really dig in.
Yeah, exactly. So our mission for this deep dive is to really unpack the core ideas of offensive realism.
Get to the heart of it.
We want to understand its basic assumptions, and see how they might explain why great powers behave the way they have historically.
Like, why are they always after more power?
Right. Or why do they sometimes team up against a rising threat? And other times, why do they try to pass the buck, let someone else deal with it?
All crucial questions.
So let's start by laying out those foundations. What are the absolute core principles of offensive realism?
Okay, so the whole theory really stands on 5 key assumptions about the world. First one, anarchy.
Anarchy, which doesn't mean like chaos in the streets,
Yeah,
right?
no, not at all. It just means there's no global 9/11, no overarching authority above states that can guarantee their safety or enforce rules.
So every state is ultimately responsible for its own survival.
Precisely. It's a self-help system. That's assumption 1.
Okay, got it. What's number 2?
Number 2 is that great powers always possess some offensive military capability. They have the means to hurt each other.
They can project force, potentially attack. Even if they don't always use it, the capability is there.
Exactly. And that potential threat leads straight into assumption 3, uncertainty about intentions.
Ah, the trust issue.
You got it. You can never be 100% sure what another state is really planning now or in the future. Intentions can change fast.
Today's friend, tomorrow's enemy, that sort of thing.
That's the worry. You just can't know for certain what's driving their decisions deep down.
Which must be a massive problem if your main concern is just surviving, right? Which brings us to number 4.
Exactly. Assumption 4 is that survival is the primary goal of every great power.
Above everything else, like theology or maybe economics.
Often, yes. Ensuring the state continues to exist is the fundamental driving force. It underpins their actions.
Survival is king. Okay, and the last one, number 5.
Number 5, great powers are rational actors.
Meaning they always make perfect decisions.
Not necessarily infallible, no, but it means they think strategically. They weigh the costs and benefits of their actions, especially concerning their survival in this anarchic, uncertain world.
Okay, let me see if I've got this. Anarchy, no world government. Offensive capability, they can hurt each other. Uncertainty, you can't trust intentions. Survival, the main goal. And rationality, they think strategically.
That's the bedrock.
So when you put all those pieces together, what's the big takeaway? What does it force states to do?
Well, the critical implication, the real punchline, is that these assumptions basically compel great powers to maximize their relative power.
Maximize power. Why relative power specifically?
Because in a system where you can't trust anyone and survival is everything, the best way to guarantee your own safety is to be the strongest kid on the block. More power compared to others means more security.
So it's not just about being strong, it's about being stronger than potential rivals.
Precisely. This inherent drive for relative power creates this constant state of security competition. Everyone's looking for an edge.
Always trying to get ahead, or at least not fall behind.
Yeah, and this can lead them to do things that might look irrational on the surface, like maybe sacrificing short-term economic gain for military buildup, even without an immediate threat. But the underlying logic is long-term security.
Okay, that makes sense. So when we talk about power here, it's not just, say, having a huge GDP, is it? How is it measured?
Good question. It's more specific than just economic size. In international politics, power, from this realist perspective, is mostly about military capability.
Military muscle.
Right, though we do distinguish between latent power and actual military power.
Latent power, what's that?
That's the underlying potential. Things like the size of your economy, your population, the resources you could draw on to build military strength. Wealth and population are the foundation.
So big economy, big population,
Yeah.
that's the potential.
Exactly. GNP, gross national product, is often used as a shorthand for that wealth, that latent power. But, and this is important, wealth doesn't automatically equal military might.
Well, a state might be rich, but choose not to spend much on its military. Or it might be inefficient, unable to effectively turn that wealth into usable military forces.
Okay, so potential isn't the same as actual capability. What kinds of military power does offensive realism really focus on then?
It generally looks at four main types: land, sea, air, and nuclear forces.
The usual suspects.
Yes, but there's a key emphasis here. Offensive realism stresses the fundamental importance of land power.
Armies on the ground. Why the emphasis there?
Because, historically, decisively defeating another great power, controlling territory, controlling populations, that almost always comes down to what armies can achieve on land.
Right, boots on the ground ultimately decide things. So what about navies and air forces? They seem pretty important today.
Oh, they definitely play crucial roles, usually supporting roles. Navies, for instance, can project power through bombardment, but that alone rarely forces a major power to give up.
What about blockades? Cutting off trade?
That's a more significant naval role, yeah. Trying to strangle an enemy's economy, weaken their ability to fight. But even blockades have limits. Powerful states can stockpile, find workarounds, trade through neutral countries.
So navies can squeeze, but maybe not deliver the final blow alone. What about air power? Strategic bombing? We hear so much about that.
Right, the idea of bombing cities, factories, infrastructure to break the enemy's will or destroy their war-making capacity.
Does it work, according to this view?
Well, the historical track record against great powers, or even some determined smaller powers, is actually pretty limited in terms of forcing surrender by itself.
Really? Even like World War II bombing?
Think about it. Italy bombing Ethiopia, the massive Allied bombing of Germany and Japan, incredibly destructive, yes, but victory ultimately depended on ground forces advancing. Even later, U.S. bombing in North Vietnam or Yugoslavia had limited success in forcing them to concede on their core goals.
People just endure it.
Often, yes. Nations can absorb a huge amount of punishment if they believe they need to. So air power is often more supplementary, damaging the enemy, supporting ground troops, but not usually the decisive factor on its own against a major power.
Okay. What about those big sea-to-land invasions? Amphibious operations like D-Day.
Amphibious assaults. They are incredibly difficult, especially against a well-defended coast held by a capable enemy.
Yeah, you'd imagine.
They require massive planning, coordination, and usually you need total control of the sea and air nearby before you even try. History has plenty of examples of failures. British attempts in the Napoleonic Wars, Gallipoli in World War I was a disaster.
But what about the U.S. and the Pacific and WWII? Those worked.
They did, but often under specific conditions, maybe targeting islands with weaker defenses or against a Japanese military that was stretched incredibly thin across a huge area. It's not easy.
So the bottom line is armies on the ground are still seen as the ultimate decider in big conflicts.
In this framework, yes. Land power reigns supreme for ultimate control.
Okay, so if a state wants to increase its power, especially that crucial land power, what are the main strategies offensive realism says it might use?
Well, there are a few key ones. The most obvious and most controversial is war.
Just straight up conquest.
Right. Now, people like Norman Angell argued back in the early 20th century in The Great Illusion that conquest doesn't really pay anymore. Too costly.
Destructive.
But offensive realism disagrees.
It acknowledges the costs, but argues that states will still resort to war if they calculate the potential gains in power seem to outweigh the risks and the price.
So war, despite everything, remains on the table as a tool for gaining power. What else, short of all-out war?
Another strategy is blackmail.
Threatening force to get what you want.
Exactly. Using the threat of military action to force concessions from another state without actually fighting. It can work sometimes, for smaller things, but it's usually not going to cause major shifts in the balance of power.
Okay. Any other strategies?
Then there's one called bait and bleed.
Bait and bleed. Sounds nasty. It is rather Machiavellian. The idea is you try to trick two of your rivals into fighting each other.
While you stay out of it.
Precisely. You let them exhaust themselves, bleed each other dry in a long war, while you conserve your own strength on the sidelines.
Can you give an example?
Well, some people interpret the delay by the US and UK in opening the second front in Europe during World War II this way.
Letting the Soviets do the bulk of the fighting against Germany for years?
Exactly. Allowing the Soviets to bear the brunt, weakening both Germany and the USSR, arguably benefited the Western Allies strategically in the long run.
Wow, okay. A pretty cynical view, but you can see the cold logic in that kind of environment.
That's the offensive realist perspective.
Now let's flip it. What if a state isn't trying to gain power, but feels threatened by someone else gaining power? How do they try to keep things stable, preserve the balance?
Right, preserving the balance of power. There are several key strategies here, too. The most direct is balancing.
Teaming up.
Yes. Threatened states form alliances, pool their resources, and work together to counter the rising power or the aggressor.
When is that most likely to happen?
It's more common when the threat feels very real and immediate, like in a bipolar system, or if a specific state in a multipolar system feels directly targeted.
So if one country looks like it's getting too strong, others gang up to stop it.
Yeah,
Makes
right.
sense. What's the alternative to directly confronting the threat?
The alternative is called buck passing.
Passing the buck, like avoiding responsibility.
Pretty much. You're trying to get another state to bear the cost and risk of stopping the threat.
Why would a state do that?
It's more likely in, say, a balanced multipolar world where the threat doesn't feel immediate to you. You might hope someone else closer to the problem, or maybe stronger, will step up and handle it.
Let someone else take the heat. Sounds risky, though. What if nobody picks up the buck?
It is risky. The threat might grow unchecked while everyone hopes someone else will act.
Okay, so balancing or buck passing.
Yeah.
What about trying to make nice with the threatening power? Appeasement.
Appeasement? Making concessions to an aggressor to try and satisfy them and avoid conflict.
How well does that work?
Generally, history suggests it's ineffective and often very dangerous,
Why is that?
because giving concessions usually just signals weakness. It tends to embolden the aggressor, makes them think they can get more, and it allows the balance of power to shift further against you.
Like throwing fuel on the fire.
Kind of. The classic example everyone points to is the Munich Agreement in 1938. Britain and France giving concessions to Hitler over Czechoslovakia.
And it didn't stop him. It just bought a little time and made him stronger.
Exactly. A cautionary tale about appeasement.
Okay, so not appeasement. Is there one more strategy? Bandwagoning.
Yes, bandwagoning.
Yeah.
This means actually aligning with the threatening power, joining the strong side.
Why would a state do that? Seems counterintuitive if they feel threatened.
It's typically a strategy for the weak and isolated. Minor powers who feel they have no other choice, no way to balance effectively. They might side with the big threat, hoping to avoid being crushed, or maybe pick up some scraps.
Safety in joining the bully.
Something like that. Think of Bulgaria and Romania initially siding with Nazi Germany in WWII. They were relatively weak, surrounded, and saw it as their best bet at the time before things changed later.
So balancing is for the strong or threatened. Buck passing is hoping someone else acts. Appeasement is dangerous. And bandwagoning is for the weak.
That's a good summary of the main options for dealing with a threat.
Right. Let's take this framework now and apply it. How does offensive realism help us understand what some major countries actually did in history?
It offers some pretty compelling explanations. Take Japan, for example, from about 1868, the Meiji Restoration, up to 1945.
What was their story through this lens?
Well, you see this almost constant drive for expansion, first focusing on Korea, leading to wars with China, then Russia. Their goals in World War I, the expansion in the 1930s into Manchuria and China, leading ultimately to Pearl Harbor and WWII.
It looks like a relentless push for more power.
Offensive realism would interpret that as driven by deep-seated security concerns. Japan saw itself as vulnerable, needing resources and strategic depth. And in an anarchic system, the only way to guarantee security was to dominate its region.
A clear pattern of seeking regional hegemony because they felt insecure. Okay. What about Nazi Germany, 1933 to 45? That seems almost too easy an example.
It does seem like a textbook case, doesn't it? Nazi Germany under Hitler is seen by almost everyone as just unambiguously aggressive.
The rapid military buildup, tearing up treaties.
Exactly. The expansionist goals were explicit. It led directly to World War II. It fits the offensive realist model of a state trying to maximize its power, achieve dominance in Europe through force.
Hard to argue with that one. What about the Soviet Union, though? We often think about communist ideology. How does realism explain Soviet actions?
That's a really interesting case. While ideology was definitely important, the argument from offensive realism is that underneath the communist rhetoric, many Soviet foreign policy decisions were driven by classic realist power politics logic.
Gotcha.
Well, their main goals seemed to be securing their own territory and establishing dominance, a buffer zone, in Eastern Europe and also Northeast Asia.
Like taking over Eastern Europe after WWII.
Precisely. Or their involvement in the Korean War. These can be seen as moves to boost their security and relative power in key strategic areas. The argument is that
when push came to shove, realist security interests often trumped purely ideological goals.
So power politics dressed up in ideological clothing sometimes.
That's one interpretation, yes. What about Italy, after it unified? They had big ambitions, right? But never quite became a top-tier power.
Yeah, Italy's interesting. Post-unification, they definitely wanted to expand, especially looking at North Africa, the Balkans. They had aspirations. But their efforts kept getting blocked or limited by the other stronger great powers like Britain, France, Austria-Hungary, later Germany.
So offensive realism helps explain Italy's drive, the desire for more influence, more security, even if they ultimately didn't have the muscle to achieve their biggest goals against tougher competition.
It explains the ambition, even if the outcome wasn't total success. Okay, so we're seeing this theme of driving for power. Now we focused on offensive realism. Is there another major school of thought within realism itself?
Yes, definitely. There's a big internal debate between offensive realism and defensive realism.
Defensive realism, how is that different?
Well, the core difference is what they think states ultimately want. Defensive realism suggests states primarily seek security, not power maximization.
So they just want to be safe, not necessarily dominant.
Exactly. Defensive realists argue states only build up enough power to defend themselves. They think aggressively chasing too much power is actually counterproductive.
Why counterproductive?
Because it scares other states. It provokes them into balancing against you, forming coalitions to stop you. They believe the international system often encourages states to maintain the current balance of power, not try to overturn it.
So trying to be the top dog can actually make you less secure in the long run, according to defensive realists.
That's their argument. They often point to examples like Kaiser Wilhelm's Germany before WWI, or Nazi Germany, or Imperial Japan.
Saying their overexpansion led to their downfall.
Precisely. Triggering overwhelming opposition.
Mm.
But offensive realists have a comeback.
Oh, what do they say?
They argue that those failures weren't because maximizing power is inherently flawed. Instead, they were strategic mistakes. Maybe those states weren't aggressive enough at key moments, or they made bad decisions about how to expand.
So not a failure of the goal, but a failure of the strategy.
That's the offensive realist counterargument, a really interesting debate about interpreting history.
Definitely. Okay, let's bring in something huge. Nuclear weapons. They seem like they'd change everything, right? How do nukes fit into this great power competition according to offensive realism?
Yeah, nukes are obviously a massive factor. But offensive realism argues they don't actually eliminate the underlying security competition between great powers.
Even with mutually assured destruction, MAD, where war is suicide.
Even then, they argue great powers still compete fiercely at the conventional level, below the nuclear threshold. And often, they even keep trying to get an edge in nuclear capabilities themselves.
Like during the Cold War.
Exactly. The US and Soviet Union could destroy each other many times over, but they still engaged in a huge, costly nuclear arms race. They kept competing with conventional forces, especially in Europe.
Trying to get even a small advantage.
Right. Think about the US developing counterforce weapons nukes designed to try and take out the enemy's nukes before they could be launched. That shows a desire for relative advantage, even in the nuclear age.
So nukes raise the stakes incredibly high, maybe make all-out war less likely, but the fundamental competition for security and power doesn't go away.
That's the core idea. The game continues just under the nuclear shadow.
Let's zoom in on one specific country, the United States. How does offensive realism look at U.S. history?
The U.S. is a fascinating case study through this lens. Think about the 19th century.
Westward expansion, manifest destiny.
Offensive realism sees that as a clear drive for regional hegemony in the Western Hemisphere, pushing European powers out, expanding across the continent.
The Monroe Doctrine, telling Europe to stay out.
Absolutely. Asserting dominance in its own backyard, it fits the theory's prediction. A rising power secures its home region first.
Okay, establishing itself as the regional hegemon, but what about U.S. involvement further away, like in the world wars in Europe?
That's often explained using the concept of the U.S. and historically the U.K. as well, acting as an offshore balancer.
Offshore balancer, meaning?
They don't necessarily want to dominate Europe themselves, but they will intervene strategically if any single power looks like it might conquer the whole continent.
Why? What's the threat to the U.S. if Germany dominates Europe?
Because a power that controls the resources and industry of all of Europe could potentially become strong enough to threaten the U.S. itself,
even across the Atlantic.
So intervening in WWI and WWII against Germany wasn't about democracy or ideology primarily, but about preventing a potential future rival from getting too strong.
From an offensive realist perspective, yes. It was about maintaining the global balance of power to ensure America's own long-term security, stepping in only when necessary to stop a continental hegemon from emerging.
Acting as the ultimate check, but from a distance. Interesting. Okay. Fast forward to the world after the Cold War. Lots of hope then for, peace, cooperation, the end of history idea. How does offensive realism view that period and our future?
Offensive realism is pretty skeptical about that kind of optimism.
Didn't buy into the peace dividend.
Not really. The core argument is that the Cold War ended, yes, but the fundamental structure of the international system anarchy didn't change.
So the underlying pressures are still there.
Exactly. Therefore, security competition is bound to continue. It critiques ideas like liberal institutionalism, the belief that international organizations foster peace, or the democratic peace theory, the idea democracies don't fight each other.
Why the critique?
Offensive realism argues that when states cooperate, it's often not because of shared values or institutions, but because their strategic interests happen to align temporarily, usually against a common threat. It's often balance of power politics in disguise.
So cooperation is strategic, not fundamental.
Frequently, yes. And offensive realism points to things that happened after the Cold War as evidence. The conflicts in the Balkans, for instance.
And more recently.
Most significantly, the rising tensions in Northeast Asia. You have China's growing power, its military modernization, missile buildups.
And the U.S. response, the continued military presence there.
Right. All seen as evidence that great power rivalry is alive and well. It makes offensive realists question if the U.S. can really act as a global peacekeeper indefinitely.
And what about China's rise specifically? How is that viewed?
It's seen as a major potential source of instability. As China gets stronger, the theory predicts it will naturally seek more influence, maybe even hegemony, in its region.
Which would trigger pushback.
Almost certainly. Balancing behavior from neighbors like Japan, India, maybe Vietnam, and probably the U.S. acting as an offshore balancer again. Offensive realism suggests things like economic engagement won't fundamentally change China's drive for power that comes with its growing strength.
So engagement policies might not prevent competition?
Unlikely from this perspective. The underlying structure and the drive for security are just too powerful.
Okay. One last point on theory. The structure of the system itself. How does the way power is distributed affect things according to offensive realism?
Structure is hugely important. Offensive realism pays a lot of attention to the distribution of power, whether the system is bipolar, like the Cold War US versus USSR, or multipolar, with several great powers.
Does one structure lead to more conflict than another?
Yes. The theory argues that the most dangerous, most war-prone structure is unbalanced multipolarity.
Unbalanced multipolarity, what's that?
That's when you have several great powers, but one of them is a potential hegemon, a state that seems to be rapidly gaining power and could potentially dominate the others.
Why is that the most dangerous?
Because it creates intense fear and uncertainty. Other states worry about the rising power's intentions, fear will try to dominate them, and might be tempted to launch preventive wars to stop it before it gets too strong.
So a clear potential winner makes everyone else nervous and trigger happy.
That's the idea. Balanced multipolarity, where power is more evenly spread among several states, is seen as less conflict-prone than that, but maybe more prone to miscalculations in smaller wars than bipolarity.
And bipolarity, like the Cold War.
Bipolarity is seen as relatively more stable, ironically. The lines are clearer, the main rivals watch each other closely, and the risks of escalation are perhaps more obvious, leading to more caution, even amidst intense competition.
So the distribution of power really shapes the dynamics. Okay, let's try and wrap this deep dive up. What are the absolute key takeaways if we look at the world through this offensive realism lens?
Well, I think it boils down to this. The international system's anarchy forces great powers to constantly worry about survival. And the best, most reliable way to ensure survival in that dangerous world is to maximize your relative power.
Be the strongest you can be compared to others.
Exactly. And this fundamental drive helps explain so many historical patterns we see again and again, forming alliances, balancing, sometimes passing the buck, always striving for more influence, sometimes regional dominance, and tragically, the recurrence of conflict.
It paints a pretty grim picture in some ways. Constant struggle, inescapable competition.
It's definitely a pessimistic view, yeah. Some call it tragic because states, even if they just want security, are forced into this competitive behavior by the system itself. But its proponents would say it's realistic. It reflects how the world often actually works.
A pragmatic, if stark, view of power politics. Okay, on that note, maybe a final thought for you, the listener, to chew on. Given everything we've discussed, the core logic of offensive realism, what might be the long-term consequences of the power shifts happening right now in the 21st century, especially with the rise of new potential great powers?
How might these dynamics play out?
Yeah. How might we see balancing, buck passing, the quest for hegemony shape international relations as the century unfolds and the world order keeps changing? Something to think about.
Definitely food for thought.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.